Thanks so much for being here. I'm Katie Jones with the City of Ypsilanti, Economic Development Equity Manager there and Project Manager for the Water Street site. So thank you all for being here. We're really excited to have this opportunity for those that might be interested in helping to develop Water Street, to hear a little bit more about it, about some of the pitfalls that might happen, as well as some of the opportunities that exist with a site like this. I do have a sign-in sheet, so I'll pass that around and get that started. But thanks for being here, and I will pass it off to Megan.
Good morning. My name is Megan Ness-Minock. I'm with Carlo Wortman. We're the planning consultants who are helping the city with the Water Street process. This is the fourth panel that we've had in a community engagement process for Water Street, and I want to welcome our esteemed group this morning. We have Patrick Tamblin, who's the Senior Vice President and Private Banking Manager, Bank of Ann Arbor. Obviously, we're excited because we just had explosions on the side to welcome you. Yeah, he is responsible for account relationship management and new business development for the Bank of Ann Arbor. He also manages their private banking group. He's active in the Ypsilanti and Ann Arbor communities. So Mr. Tamblin sitting in the center, and then to your left, yes, is Bill Kinley. He's the founder of Praxis Properties, which is a family-owned real estate development and management company serving Ann Arbor, Saline, Ypsilanti, and the Greater Washtenaw County area. He founded Phoenix Company in 1979, which grew from a basement office to a $25 million in annual revenue. After selling Phoenix, he founded Praxis Properties in 2017. Its portfolio includes over 650,000 square feet of leased space across office, flex warehouse, retail, and residential uses throughout Washtenaw County. So thank you so much for joining us. Also, at the other end of the table, we have Michael Caldwell, who's an attorney and shareholder at Zosmer. He's their environmental law practice leader. He has represented Fortune 50 companies, municipalities, small businesses, and individuals in a variety of complex litigation matters, including environmental and general civil disputes. As one of the foremost environmental litigators in the state, he's handled cases including class actions involving soil and groundwater remediation claims, Superfund and Part 201 cost recovery, toxic torts, wetland permits, mold disputes, and environmental insurance. Covered both in the state and federal courts. So we'll give a short round of applause for our panelists to thank them for spending with us. And thank you to the folks here who are at Spark East who've joined us as well. And thank you to Spark East for hosting us. I'm going to pose a series of questions to the panel. If audience members who are here in person have questions, we'll take them during the last 20 minutes of the event. But if you have a pressing question that just can't wait and you feel like it would contribute to the flow of the conversation, please raise your hand and either myself or my colleague Mateo Pasalacqua will get you an index card. If you could write the question on that, then I will work it into the conversation if I can. Also, I may interrupt the panelists at some point. All of us who are deep in real estate and environmental law and banking may use acronyms and jargon, and so I've warned the panelists that I will probably interrupt them a couple of times. And finally, at the end, we are videotaping this whole entire panel, so if you have a question at the end, but would feel uncomfortable coming to the microphone and being on video that's going to be posted on the city's website, just write that question down again on an index card, and then we'll, either myself or Mateo will pose it. So with that, I'm going to dive into our first question for our panelists. If advising a client or colleague, how would you describe the opportunities that are possible with the redevelopment of the Water Street area?
Pat, you're in the middle.
Okay, I'll happily kick this off. Well, it's an exciting possibility because it's contiguous land in the heart of downtown Ypsilanti. So it really is going to take some vision to say what combination of types of properties could work on that site, given the history of the site and the environmental, which we'll address in a bit. So if it's a mix of commercial that might front Michigan Ave, if there's a mix of housing options, maybe further back on the property, And so I just think it's a large piece of land that has potential. And it's had potential for years, and there's been issues in cleanups and things like that. But I think the right developer with the right incentive packages and financing package may find a way to bring this thing to life. And with that, I'll ask Bill to chip in.
Sure, I'll say there's an extraordinary opportunity here. You look at the site, I'm looking now at the layout of this Water Street development area compared to the whole area of Ypsilanti that it's center of. It has great frontage on Michigan Avenue, good accessibility, wonderful river frontage, which most communities in Ypsilanti area in Michigan have not particularly capitalized on the river frontage. I think this development can do that. There's some real opportunity, particularly for residential fronting on the river. It's a beautiful river. It just hasn't been taken advantage of yet. I think the opportunities are there for a clean slate, 30-some acres. It's a wonderful opportunity for multi-use development.
And as the environmental lawyer, I'm usually the voice of gloom and doom. But the fact that there are some environmental challenges associated with the property, to me, cries out opportunity because of all the incentives that are available, and whether it be TIF financing, grants, and other related incentives. Just in general, you want your property to be at least a little contaminated. From my perspective, of course, as an environmental lawyer, that's where I see opportunity. But I think also true for developers.
Maybe we have a moment, if you could, all of you maybe go into a little bit of detail on what those financial incentives could be, namely what is the TIF, tax increment financing, and the brownfield redevelopment, monies that are available through Washtenaw County. If you had any other detail that you could add to what those incentives might be, or how you would look at them from your point of view, either as a realtor, a financier, a real estate developer, financing, or environmental lawyer.
Do you want to start that out?
We'll start or do a fantasy draft and going back the other way. With TIF, you basically calculate how much you will increase the value of the property by with your development, and then the additional tax revenue that would be generated by that incremental increase gets captured, and you, instead of going into the city and or state's coffers, it gets captured and can be used to reimburse you as the developer for eligible activities. Now, these include, but are not limited to, any cleanup that you have to do, or response activities, which is an environmental term for things you have to do to deal with contamination. In terms of due care, phase ones can be reimbursed. The cost of doing a phase one. A lot of those costs can be reimbursed over time because it can go 20, I've seen even 30 years used to capture and reimburse you from that incremental tax increase. But it's not limited to just pure environmental cleanup activities. It can also be used for demolition and some infrastructure expenses in the right situation. So it really can be a great benefit, and I know banks will lend on that revenue source, because at least so far the government is thought to be a credible source of those kinds of funds. Sorry.
Yeah, I would pick up where Mike left off and just say any development effort here probably does look for all of those brownfield development, TIF opportunities, grants for cleanup, whatever that might be. And a bank is going to look at the whole capital plan for a project like this, any financing source will, and say how do those TIF credits, ongoing TIF benefits come into the project? How do grants, do they not require repayment? Any of the different buckets that a developer might successfully bring to this, the bank is going to look at that and say, how does that help benefit the cash flow of this project going forward? The other half of that economic equation gets into what revenue, either from property sale or ongoing rental income stream, is going to be coming in from this project, and can it service the debt requirement from the bank's perspective? Can it handle the capital expectations of its equity partners who want distributions or money out of the project eventually? And so I would just say that Michael would be a better source of understanding the different buckets of funds that might be available, but a banker is going to look at it and say, how does that contribute to the overall project from an economic standpoint? And will that project be able to repay the debt?
I would look at this as most likely will end up being a public-private partnership in some manner. The reason I say that is this is most likely going to end up a multi-phase development. There's several pockets here, 44 acres, that are from all urban development, and putting in a new road system, all the utilities that are there, and putting those in before having sales. And I think that having the city involved in the infrastructure, and the financing for that, I think would be quite important. I don't know what advantages there can be with the city, but I know there could be a very low interest borrowing rate if necessary. But the city would then also have to, whoever puts in, whether it's the city or the private developer, whoever puts in all that road infrastructure system is going to have to deal with whatever leftover environmental issues there are. So there might be some incentives along the way. It's going to take some master planning, master full planning to make it all work.
Well, thank you all. Michael, you mentioned you were doom and gloom.
Yes.
Sometimes, but this is a question for the whole panel in terms of that. What words of caution or concern would you share for this site, for brownfields in general, again, if it's advising a client or colleague?
For myself, a site like this, the developer is going to have to, I think, be in it for the long run. It will take, some time before you start seeing your profits. You're going to need, enough backing to allow you to do that. It's a pretty significant time and financial investment that's going to be necessary to develop the site. In part because of the environmental challenges. I guess in terms of caution, that would be a caution. You can't, I don't think you can do this on maxing out your credit cards type of financing plan that we all did when we got out of college.
I would add to that I might hit it on the head. You got to identify the cost of what it's going to take to clean up the site or your portion of the site, and make sure that whatever else on the site might not be migrating toward you. But my caution would be, you have to identify that cost and then decide how are you going to be able to either find the government resources to help you take care of that, because that does become part of your total project cost. And if you're trying to finance that versus equity injection, that creates a repayment requirement. So I think that just has to be part of the broader plan: soft costs, hard costs, environmental, upfront, and infrastructure.
If we look for an example, current example of something similar, maybe not quite the scale of the project in Ann Arbor, it's going to a Michigan site near the Broadway Bridge, Roxbury development. Extremely
Thank you all for that. One of the things I know that the city only mentioned is that they have done a fair amount of cleanup. Some cleanup is going on. The intent is for them to do a baseline environmental assessment for the whole site, and maybe phase 1 as well. Yes, so those are the first 2 phases in the environmental, process in order for folks to make sure that they and themselves are protected from liability under Michigan's environmental laws. Maybe if, between the 3 of you, you could go into a little bit more about what that phase 1 or phase 2 would look like, and what a developer walking into this maybe who doesn't have environmental experience needs to bank on, in terms of if they are taking the baton from the city, what should they be prepared for time-wise, financial-wise, in order, what they're stepping into.
Sure. Yeah, I meant in my last answer was a little halting because I couldn't remember what I wanted to say. And I wanted to mention that the city is done, is getting this site development ready by doing a cleanup. They've got a grant, and I think the goal is to clean up the, I guess you could call it, for lack of a better term, hot spots where developers would not be able to take title to the property without incurring liability for the cleanup. Different types of contamination or strict liability, they fall under strict liability statutes, and those can be hard to redevelop because nobody wants to step into those shoes. And the city, with its grant money, is taking care of those areas so that the site, the rest of the site, will then be in a state where developers can take title without incurring responsibility for doing the full cleanup. There are still responsibilities as opposed to liability for your due care, even as an innocent, non-liable owner. You have to prevent unacceptable exposures to what's still there. And the science, the environmental field has really progressed to the point where that generally is not insurmountable, either financially or technically. Used to be you'd have some contaminated soil and you buy the property, it's like, oh, I gotta pay to excavate that and take it across the state to a landfill, I can accept that waste. Now, generally, you can put a parking lot over top of it, or depending on the contamination, you put your building over top of it, as long as you don't come into contact with it. So there's a lot of options there, with the city having done kind of the baseline to get it development ready. And I think it's important too, and we haven't talked maybe too much about this, but one of the challenges from the environmental standpoint of this property is that it's not a single operator. I was involved I live in Wixom, and I was able to get involved in the redevelopment of the Ford plant there. Well, it's a Ford plant, and it had been manufacturing for, back in the 50s or maybe even earlier than that. And, there was some contamination out there. But it was one operator, and you kind of knew, and they did a nice job, Ford did a nice job of phase 1, what operations took place where, therefore we should look for this type of contamination there. But it was generally speaking one operator. One of the challenges here is there were a number of industrial uses by different operators over, many, many decades, back I think to the 1800s. And so having that baseline information is going to be important. And I think it would be important for the city to have some of that grant money in reserve that, if a developer comes and puts together a proposal, but based on the phase 1 that the city has done and whatever additional due diligence the developer does, there's a decent possibility that there could be some of this type of contamination that we'd have to deal with if it's there in this way, you know, and that's gonna take X number of dollars to investigate, you know, do you have funds available to bridge that gap between what we're planning on spending and what we're gonna have to based on the site-specific conditions of this particular portion of the site. So that might be one thing to keep in mind. It's easy for me to say, you know, hang on to a few $1 million when we got so many other uses for it. But I think that'd be one way to create some incentives for development if there was some slush funds, probably not the right term, but you know, some available incentive money in that regard.
I would just frame it that the phase one is going to look at the history of the property, and they're going to, it's really a cursory, not cursory, but it's a look, an educated look, to see are there potential hazards on this site. And once that's determined, then that consultant's going to say, well, we should do more. That would be considered a phase two. We got to do soil borings and find out what's there, what the, you know, the outline of what's there, and is it migrating between sites. So you try and identify the issues, what's in the soil, and is it stable or is it still moving? And you mentioned a BEA, Megan, and that is an opportunity to say, look, I might be buying this property for development, but I had nothing to do with the prior contamination of it. And so you do a baseline environmental assessment that says, here's the known contaminants at the time you took it over. And as long as down the road there's no new contaminants on that site, that you didn't contribute to the problem here. So it gives a developer, a purchaser, kind of a bright line that that was the problem, knew it was there, I'm not contributing to it. So it does help alleviate liability. It may or may not, it doesn't help the level of cleanup that's necessary.
It sounds to me like in addition to having the phase one done, that there have been a number of borings already on the site, so that paying attention to what's there, they wouldn't have any idea what all was there if they hadn't done a bunch of boring. So I would expect that they're well on their way toward a full phase two. And the BEA is a very effective means. The state of Michigan is one of the few that have this kind of protection against liability for a subsequent owner. I was fortunate enough to have, I think, the second BEA done in the state of Michigan in 1995 in Ypsilanti. It was on a site on Railroad Street. It turned out very benign, but went through the process. I've done some other sites since then, but it's a fairly easy process to go through. I would need the whole look at this site to be focused on environmental. I think environmental is solvable. I think there are enough hands in the thing that have paid attention to it. There are enough incentives, governmental incentives, for a developer to come in and look at that. I think more importantly, once they get past the fact that it is a solvable problem, they'll start looking at what is the demand and what can really go on the site.
Yeah. And I will say, I belong to a network of firms that specialize in environmental law across the country, in most of the states and a couple of countries as well. And we're the only one that has anything like the BEA process, and everybody's jealous. It's a very bright line. Banks love it, developers love it, and it's a real opportunity for development in Michigan. And we represented the city of Detroit when the 1995 amendments to the environmental laws were made that came up with this BEA process. And even the environmentalists, you know, because you had the environmentalists, you had the municipalities, you had industrial, you know, interests, all, you know, trying to get what they needed. And even the environmentalists realized that it doesn't do any good for contaminated property in Ypsilanti like this to be warehoused, because developers who might otherwise want to locate there don't want to incur the liability for the cleanup. And so, because what happens then is, well, then that developer moves out to the suburbs or to some green space, puts his industrial plant, and that area becomes contaminated. And so you get urban sprawl, and you get all sorts of problems. And so we realized that everybody realized that creating a mechanism that the baseline environmental assessment, or BEA, really solves a major problem that is in the interest of really every interest group. And it really is very effective. Like I said, you still, after you buy it, you're not liable for the cleanup. You still have to exercise responsibly, due care, and it might include putting in some barriers to prevent exposure to the contamination, but you don't have to clean up the underlying contamination if people are not coming into contact with it.
Speaking of good things that the government can do, what's the best thing for the city of Ypsilanti to do to support the redevelopment of Water Street? You've mentioned helping with the environmental side in terms of soil borings and cleanup and whatnot, but are there other things that you suggest, or things that rise to the top for you, maybe streamlining processing, dedicating staff consultants? You have the idea of extra funds to help along the way.
One thing I think that the city could approach, and I know that there's been some open discussion about this, is whether or not this site was ever an indigenous people's camp area. That has been brought up. It could be brought up again. My gut tells me that it wouldn't be appropriate if the indigenous peoples in this area would have been the Wyandots and Hurons, and for the most part they built their campsites on high ground, which would have been across the river. But it's still been an open question of whether or not some group will come up and say we really have to investigate whether or not this truly was indigenous people's campground. I don't know how that's to be done, but that has come up fairly recently in the discussions again. So if the city, that's something the city is going to have to work to alleviate more than a developer. I would think if the city can approach that and resolve it one way or another, I think that would be very important so it didn't become an impediment.
From my perspective, I think it would be helpful for any incoming developer, in-state or out-of-state, to be able to talk with Katie or someone at the city that can say, hey, these are all the financial incentives that we're aware of that you might qualify for this type of a project. And that could be TIF, it could be grants, environmental cleanup grants, or other things. So I just think to have an understanding of what available resources are out there to share with anybody that might submit a qualification statement or future proposal. And these people likely would be pretty knowledgeable developers, so they're going to have their own sense of that. But if it's unique to Michigan and they're coming from out of state, that would be helpful. So that would be my suggestion.
Yeah, I think being a clearinghouse of that type of information it would be invaluable. I think I know there's a planned public engagement. What would you like to see here? From a developer's standpoint, my suggestion would be a guided public engagement process where the options for development are perhaps identified ahead of time, and because otherwise you might end up with recommendation of 75 pickleball courts and giant sound barriers to keep the sound from affecting the nearby neighborhoods, where you have to realize that developers are not going to be engaged in this development unless they can make a dollar. And so I don't know if starting with a blank slate for that process is the most efficient way to go.
I think that had been done in the past, but in this round, we wanted to ground people at first with what is possible. And then there's a community benefits ordinance here in the city of Ypsilanti, so the questions are very targeted about what those community benefits should be and what people are looking for. Not necessarily that type of development or where it should go because of the presentations we've had before about the complexities of the site and the volatility of the site. It's become more and more apparent that where that contamination is and how it's cleaned up and what will happen, that's going to actually drive the design in some ways more than what the general public is looking for.
Yeah, and for instance, there's a very useful streamlined process for TIF to reimburse housing developments. And it makes dealing with MISTA and in the state, the EGLE is the environmental agency, the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. Used to be DNR, then it was DEQ, and if they change the name again, I will retire. I just want to make that perfectly clear. On the other hand, the state agency, EGLE, their views on the use of TIF money have evolved over the last 10 years and they now are very hesitant to allow TIF captured taxes to be used to pay for vapor mitigation systems for owner-occupied residences. So, because generally speaking, they're fine if it's like a big apartment building. They would pay for the vapor mitigation system to protect the occupants of the building. But if it's a condo association, they found that the association is made up of a bunch of environmental novices that don't really know the importance of maintaining a vapor mitigation system. So that benefit, that incentive might not be available if it's for individual residential homes or even a condo building. So I agree with you that the combination of environmental conditions and the incentives available, the available incentives, will do a lot to drive the type of development that makes the most sense for the most developers.
Well, we're at our second to last question. The city's considering a phased approach to developing the site. In your experience, how long would it take to fully develop a site of this size and complexity?
Many years. That's the sum total in my mind related to the demand. I think that it begs the question of what is a good site plan. There's several, they're in the packets and on the wall here, there's some that I agree with more than others. The one, the original, on my bed involved in Ypsilanti, the Biltmore plan was in the year 2000, I think, was 100% rental units. There were 400 and some. At the time, I thought this doesn't make a lot of sense, but for a number of reasons, it passed on. The developers didn't make it work. But there are several other kinds of development. I'd like to see a master plan done that people could live with. Not all developer driven, not all resident wish list driven, but something that makes sense for the site, where it is on Michigan Avenue, how close it is to the centroid of downtown Ypsilanti and Depot Town. It needs to have some identity of itself, with some retail in my mind, and some coffee houses and maybe some service businesses, but some owner-occupied as well as rental, some affordable, a whole mix. There's one from 2020, a plan that has a lot of those things going on. I think there's going to be a lot of demand for single-family lots. That may or may not be the case, but that's what would seem to be reasonable. Ypsilanti has a lot of demand from owner-occupied these days. Having that plan done, overlaid with the contamination, I think will drive at a pretty bad contamination drive, the whole layout around just that. There's money to be taken care of. There are ways to take care of pockets of contamination. I'd like to see a really good demand-driven site plan, and then start working backwards toward the environmental issues.
I agree with Bill's comments on that. It will take, I think, a long time, and I think it's going to be driven by the demand on the layout, the site plan. That's a really good point. And it's going to be driven by the demand of the people that want to be there, and the absorption. If it's multifam, how long does it take them to fill up a building before they start the next? I don't think you'd want to see a bunch of spec property there that never fills up. So I agree with Bill, this is a long time project, and I think the mix of uses needs to be well laid out. And I think ultimately the community will decide how long it takes to build this thing out completely.
Yeah, and Bill, your point is well taken. Both demand and environmental, you really have to work with those. Like there may be some areas that don't have vapor concerns, because not all, contamination, different types of contaminants pose different types of issues. Metals aren't gonna, vaporize and go through your basement slab, so it doesn't really, almost doesn't matter how high you have, arsenic or metals contamination. If you put a building over it, or a parking lot's going to be over it, it really doesn't matter too much. And maybe because the state seems to be, for reasons that I would argue with, hesitant to spend some of that TIF incentive money on vapor systems for owner-occupied properties, because they trust larger management companies to properly run the vapor mitigation systems. If it's 6 to 1, half a dozen the other, it would make sense to put the owner-occupied residential in the areas that don't pose vapor issues, and put some apartment buildings over the areas that have vapor mitigation requirements. So it really just takes a baseline of information to know what's out there, and some rational planning. But planning is the key. And I agree with my esteemed colleagues that this is not going to happen overnight. You got to find developers that will be in it for the long run, and can partner with the right people.
Well, thank you for that. The city's going to enter a request for qualifications process, and that RFQ for sure should be out in the first quarter of next year. As we're closing up this panel, what are your words of wisdom in regard to Water Street in this redevelopment area? And that could be directed to potential RFQ respondents, the city, staff, officials, or the general public.
That's a big question.
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
How about solving world peace, or is that on the
That's part of that, yeah.
Well, what would you hope to see?
In an RFQ, or you hope to have responses to the RFQ?
In the responses to the RFQ and 10 years from now.
10 years from now, I'd like to see a phase development well underway and maybe even close to completion. It's going to take a carefully crafted RFQ to bring in developers that have the wherewithal, can see the vision, that have an interest in public engagement, because it's going to be very important, and would be willing to essentially share responsibilities. There may be one developer that does all the multifamily, another developer, sub-developer, if you want to call it that, that does all the single-family residential lot sales and build-out. So it could be more than one under a master development agreement. I think that might move the process along better, but it's going to have some kind of master planning, something that oversees the entire process.
I hope Katie's inundated with a bunch of developers who want to talk through this project with her and the city. And I think Bill hit on it too. It is going to take public engagement because we'll have a lot of voices at the table on all sides. And you can't dismiss that part of the equation because it's going to be, it'll be a hot topic and it'll be one that a lot of people are interested in. So I think you have to wholeheartedly engage that. I'm an optimist. I would like to see this moving along in that 10-year window as well. And moving towards something that really does bring additional life to downtown Ypsilanti and provides housing alternatives for people that are priced out of neighboring communities and like the energy and the dynamic here in Ypsilanti.
Yeah, I think in terms, what I would look for if I was the city, in terms of proposals, qualifications, are developers that either have themselves or more likely are partnering with the right people to kind of bring a full suite of skills and experience. We've talked about environmental. Part of the site is, was a former, I think maybe 2 different landfills. And so you're going to have geotechnical issues that you have to deal with. I think one of the proposals had proposed to put a pond over top of what used to be a landfill. From an environmental standpoint, it's the worst possible thing you can do because the water will just infiltrate through all the landfill contaminants and go right out into the groundwater, and being so close to the river, it's going to seep into the river eventually. So having that, and with a site that has so many past operations, different sources of contamination that pose different challenges, I think you need to have, a full suite of skills to deal with that. Environmental, geotechnical, certainly sounds like that'd be myself, lawyer, but you're going to need a developer with some wherewithal.
Okay, well, we've gotten some questions in, and I've got 2 that are directed. So the first for Bill, does Ypsilanti have a strong demand for housing at this point?
My observation is that it does. And I think multi-levels of housing. I think that there's been strong demand for the project that was just approved and already started being occupied on North Street, next to the railroad. There's small single-family houses that looks to be extraordinarily successful, partly because it's an aggressive price point. My recollection, this is from 25 years ago when Bill Moore was proposing its development. I heard from a number of people that I knew that lived in Ypsilanti that would like to retire in Ypsilanti. Had single-family houses, they'd been here forever, but they wanted to end up with like a condominium in a nice spot in Ypsilanti, and they didn't find good alternatives. They ended up moving quasi-west. They wouldn't break that Route 23 barrier, but they ended up along Dixboro. They at the time said if there were some opportunities to buy condos with river frontage on that Water Street parcel, they would stay here in a heartbeat. So I think there is a demand. That would be probably more market rate, but I think it should be a mix of market rate and affordable, various styles of townhouses, single-family houses. I think the demand is there. You're seeing that. Ypsilanti has grown in desirability, and of course that ends up, the prices have gone up. Not everybody's happy about that, but that is the fact of the matter. When the demand and price will go up, that will help alleviate the high cost of construction. Construction costs right now are at an all-time high, so things, sales or rentals have to make economic sense. And I think that's where giving a range of possibilities will be very important. I'm not sure whether that answers the question or not.
I think that did.
And tap dance.
I think that did. So I'm going to direct a question to Patrick, and then based on some of the some questions that came forward, I'm going to give my mic to Katie and Jeremy. Katie Jones from the city and Jeremy McCallum from AKT Peerless. This is for Patrick. Does Bank of Ann Arbor have experience providing loans for brownfield projects? Further, has the bank used tax increment financing as collateral to secure a loan for a developer?
I can say we have been involved in projects where TIF financing was part of the total stack, the capital stack and the project details. So yes, we have had experience with that. And brownfield development, there have been projects where, again, brownfield development funds have been part of the capital stack that came to the table with that project. So I don't know that we've funded directly those project cleanup costs, but I'm sure in some cases we have. But I would say from a large scale, that would just be part of the total deck that we're evaluating to see if that project makes economic sense from the bank standpoint.
All right, so the first one we have here is, can someone from the city explain how much cleanup the city is going to do? I'm confused with the current status of the site, given all of the environmental work that has been done. So what we've been doing for the last couple of years is, and the map is back here, is working on the DUR storage, what we're calling the DUR storage yard. So there's PCB contamination on that site, and so in that area of the site. And so what we're doing is we've been testing for a couple of years, and then we also just recently, I think as early as 2 weeks ago, we started doing the excavation work to remove the PCBs to eliminate that risk. And so that's been the majority of what we've been doing for the last few years. I know there's been some other things, and so I'll pass it over to Jeremy as well to talk a little bit more about some of the previous efforts.
Hi, Jeremy McKelly with AKT Peerless, environmental consultant for the city. Yeah, as Katie mentioned, currently removing hazardous levels of PCBs, so costly and necessary to remove for redevelopment. I mean, the site itself, there are contaminants throughout the site, so depending upon the development and the area, developer will, as the panel mentioned, do their due diligence and identify what may or may not have to be done from a due care environmental perspective on the site. But the city's addressing kind of the, I'd say probably the worst area that we've evaluated to remediate currently.
Shannon has a question, I think I think does it tap onto what we're talking about?
Yeah. And I'm so sorry, I have complicated multi-level questions, and this specifically is to all of you on things that we touched on, but going further into the weeds, because I think the important conversation is what the reality of the legal requirements are, what the reality is of how we're going to underwrite that financing. We had some questions about being able to drive it on feasibility, but and we talked about WIC some, but in reality, the type of uses of this site when we compare industrial to residential are two different beasts whatsoever, and we need to talk about residential criteria. Number one, when we're looking at sources right now of even just VOC and P&A, as well as the portions of landfills, there's certain criteria and grants when we talk about residential that may not fund those. And it's a conversation that we have to have because it does drive design extremely. So, the other, in certain things when we're using any type of MSHDA criteria, depending on the funding, we'll have to reach the highest levels of residential criteria. So we will be required to reach MFA. When we're talking about for sale housing, we'll have to do uncollateralized tax increment financing. What does that look like? How are we going to underwrite that? When we even talk about the incentives used right now, the EGLE requirements and the residential requirements change considerably. So I think it's important for the community to know and city council to know what that looks like when we're deed restriction, what it takes to reach a no further action By the way, I am closing on multiple Eagle deals with vapor barriers and residential for sale in single family right now. But what does that mean? What is, right now, the whole vapor barriers mitigation has changed over the last year considerably. We have Eagle actually camped out in MSHDA offices when they're looking at MFAs and other statuses, so that's ongoing. But I think it's important to hear from the experts that when we're underwriting residential, we're underwriting tax increment financing, what the lenders are going to look at. It's more than a BEA. It's the requirements of an evolving Eagle and funding mechanism, the design, the feasibility, and same thing. We went back and forth for a year between MSHDA and Eagle and deed restricting, requiring, even though in the community that we had to deed that no one could dig, no one could do wells, we had to put restrictions in our HOAs. I just would like to have that be a broader part of the conversation from experts beyond developers, that these are critical components in the design.
I mean, it sounds like you provided a lot of that expert analysis yourself. I think it was very, very useful.
But they want to hear from you. They want to hear from the attorneys and they want to hear from the lenders. They don't want to hear this from the developers.
Yeah, yeah. So on the project that you said owner occupied, was that with TIF financing?
That's with Missing Middle. So now MSHDA has my neighborhood in Missing Middle. It's their first, if anyone knows MSHDA typically doesn't like to do environmental at all,
Right.
which needs to be a conversation too as we look at LIHTC and multifamily. And it's critical because we're not going to be able to put those buildings in certain areas in this site, in the design. But now they are looking at opportunities where they will get a little bit more flexible on environmental, and that's ongoing. They have 2 Eagle staff members that are in the MSHDA offices right now that drive what they do an environmental review process right now. It changes. Sorry. I think, AKPT can say that. And so, 2 things. And then with the expansion of housing TIF, we've had to use CDFIs because, the same thing. A big portion of this, if we're looking at for sale, whether it be market, whether it be subsidized, right, that's uncollateralized. So we're talking about very creative financing, same thing. These type of things impact our design or underwriting, and if we're going to achieve any measures of affordability.
Sounds to me like it's something the city needs to resolve rather than the developer. You've laid out a very complicated set of criteria, which I think is very important, but it's not up to the developer. In fact, if you put that in an RFQ, most will probably run screaming in the night.
And I think, it's just an important part of the reality of what this is in conversations to hear from experts to, say, listen, this is we have to take that on a case-by-case basis on the master plan in each one of those subset phases that are going to be resolved. And some of them are not cut clear. We've got to be able to see that there's specific deed restrictions, specific projects that are, the feasibility that's going to be done, the way that it's financed, and the way that it's underwritten. So the problem is you can't take this on from a beautiful design. This has to be structured in a way that's thought through with all of these moving pieces accordingly. And I only bring it up because it's an important part of the conversation for the city to take on. And it's important to hear from the experts that this is the reality.
Yeah, no, I think what you're talking about is absolutely right. I was trying that as clearly as you to convey that it's an iterative process. The environmental will drive to some degree what you can do with the property, or what incentives are available for how do we maximize the incentives and the extent to which the ultimate development looks like what the community wants.
And for reality here, when we talk about dirt, I think we need to talk about the impact of what dirt means in residential once again, because if we're gonna lay a vapor barrier in commercial district, that's much different than residential, and if we're trying to get affordable housing in. I'm the developer of Dorsey Estates. We received a missing middle grant that we had to go to an MFA on. I think we moved 130,000 cubic yards of dirt there that had to go to a type 2 landfill. So the reality of the unknowns of dirts could be absolutely extraordinary in costs, even with testing.
Yeah, as far as the testing, the state has become much more comfortable with, was it incremental, help me AKT, incremental testing, so you use, an average, I know I was involved in a project in Northville where they each area separated each, 3-foot layer, and okay, this layer clean, this layer we're gonna have to do something about because it's next to the Rouge River. And with testing, with enough testing, you can avoid a lot of the actual excavation and disposal costs.
And if we bury them under parking lots and obviously roads where that could happen, it's just about, so what I say, because when we talk about doing public process, people absolutely love to get in the pretty designs and the pretty realities, which we love as developers as well. But the reality from this is a successful plan is going to come with a very strategic understanding of how to do the brownfield pieces and how to do it efficiently. And then, first and foremost is how much of that can we bury under roads and parking lots, and where can we look at buildings right now. And unfortunately, I think there is some flexibility to move some of these pieces around, but there's going to be some hotspots that we're never going to reach a LIHTC component at. So some of these
That's where you put the pickleball courts.
and I think, exactly, or where, whatever that rec center, whatever it's going to be, but that conversation needs to come from the community, because that's where the misconceptions are.
And to your point, I think I said earlier, with metals, they don't vaporize, so, it really doesn't, if you can cover them up, it really doesn't matter how contaminated they are. That doesn't apply nearly as broadly to single-family residential, where you literally have kids crawling around the backyard, and that's what the residential cleanup criteria is.
And ask AKT what we've been through with metals, that it takes it to another higher level if you're getting any state funding for grant dollars. Between Eagle and Mishra, we've been all over the board on metals over the last year without clear consistency.
The question is, who does this analysis? Is this done before the RFQ goes out? Or is this done by the RFQ respondents? That's the big issue. They're knowledgeable in this, they've got to stated that. But the question is, should this be done before the RFQ goes out?
Yes. Sooner rather than later. Fine.
Okay, wait. This is a great conversation, but we do have a couple more questions that have come forward. So I know, Jeremy, you wanted to answer some things.
Yeah.
And I have two. Yep.
Again, Jeremy from AKT. I'll just add a little addition on to what Shannon's saying here. So, yeah, there's a bunch of analysis that has been done. Currently, the city's in the process of doing phase 1 of the entire site, so we'll know all the historical side of things. There's roughly about 40 parcels prior to its current combination. It does depend on the funding sources as to the higher level of restrictions, as Shannon mentioned. Once you go down the Michigan path, you are moving towards an NFA, no further action. It really all depends on the funding source. But remember, if there's no market and no developer, then the conversation we're having is right. So it's a chicken and egg situation. Shannon's point is valid. There are restrictions associated with what types of development occur on the site. Based upon funding sources and based upon the type of building, right? Industrial versus a single-family residential, two different ranges of criteria associated with what you can do on site. And then I'll just add also to a question that was asked, is there a risk to prospective developers' current work being done negating the current work the current work being done by the city, is that negating any incentive programs that would be available to developers? The short answer to that is no. The current work being done out there right now is utilizing state allocated funds for cleanup. There are a slew of other funds available for developers as they come in. And it is the city's thought ahead on this. To the panel's earlier point, there are funds kind of set aside for the developer-related activities because it is anticipated there may be developer-related activities from a due diligence perspective and from a cleanup perspective.
Okay,
Yeah.
we're gonna get it. All right.
Well, thank you everyone for sharing all that context. And this question, I think, piggybacks on some of the conversation that you've been having. What would you say to residents that want to see a green space in the Water Street redevelopment and/or million-dollar homes in this area? Are those feasible? Is it possible?
I think it depends on the desires of the community and the master plan that's put out there. I mean, I think the city does have to identify what's doable and what's reasonable on that site. And if half of that were green space, would that economically make sense? Who actually carries the burden on that? Is that the city's asset then?
Mhm.
That's all I'll say on that.
I think there'll be a fair amount of green space, hopefully along the river, as part of the process. That should be a public asset, and that's, as I mentioned, this site that's being developed now in Ann Arbor. The river frontage is under control of the Conservancy, and they're developing that for public benefit. That certainly should be part and parcel. River frontage is the prime area of this scenic area, and I think the border-to-border trail goes through that area right now. It should continue, and there's certainly funds for development along there from, like in Dexter, where they took a dam out, they fixed up all the frontage along there. I think where the Peninsular Park Dam comes out, there's money going to be allocated to improve in the sense of making it more natural. The frontage that is exposed when the river is flowing free. I think that same kind of development for natural resource development for the use of the public citizenry is very important.
I know from the city's point of view, when we've been communicating with the public, it's been very important to say that there needs to be some taxable value coming out of this redevelopment, so it couldn't all be green space, but also that there is an easement along the riverfront for the border-to-border trail, and the city sees that as an asset to be built upon.
I would think that perhaps one of these hot spots that we can build on, if it's properly treated, could be a pocket park. And that could be a public benefit that's part of the whole concept. That's all to be determined where that would be, but I think it would be important to have a gathering spot for this. This area will have its own identity. Water Street and whatever the name is going to be into the future, but having a pocket park there for gathering for anybody and certainly the local residents is probably a good idea.
And in terms of million-dollar homes, and I'm just going to throw in my own spin on this, a single-family home on large lots or riverfront lots, is that something that, if residents were saying that they wanted that, is that something that's feasible?
From an environmental standpoint, single-family homes of any size are probably the biggest challenge. Both, for the metals reason, for vapor intrusion. So I think that would be a challenge. You can do anything if the dollars and cents make sense. From an environmental standpoint, you could clean it all up to residential. I mean, if you want single-family homes, you really, I mean, you can certainly restrict groundwater use, but you can't, in a realistic way, have engineering controls that might theoretically be there, but I don't think the state is going to agree to, put engineering controls that have to be maintained on a single-family property. So I think that would be the single-family homes, probably the biggest challenge from an environmental standpoint.
As far as demand, I would assume that if there are going to be single-family homes, there'd be single-family lots, which would be zoned in a way that wouldn't preclude somebody from spending a lot of money. You can even do extraordinarily expensive houses that are fairly compact. I can't say a $1 million house, but it wouldn't behoove the city to encourage large lots or unrestricted heights. So height limitations, setbacks, all those things can govern what type of homes go there. How much people want to spend on a 2,500 square foot house is up to them. They can do gold-plated whatever, like our leadership seems to be fond of these days. But I doubt very much we got a $2 million house.
All right, and now this question zooms out large. How important do you feel it is to consider Water Street as one quadrant of a larger master plan, including Michigan Avenue, Riverside Park, Depot Town, and south to I-94, including the former Ford plant?
That's up to
What
you.
does that mean? That's a,
Yeah.
You guys are the
that is a
vision
huge
guys.
swath of responsibility to digest all in one thought. So Katie, you have a segment ahead of you. And if that's the broader picture, it'd be nice to see those things as complementary to each other, and certainly and Bill mentioned this last week, but if retail and restaurants and other attractions are along Michigan Avenue here, that's going to compete with downtown Ypsilanti, it's going to compete with Depot Town. So there's going to be some constituents there that might get excited if it seems a threat. So I won't say any more there. I think it is a challenging question because you throw in the Visteon plant and everything else, and you're talking a huge swath of real estate to think about how can that best be used. That's not my area of expertise.
Well, to the group who's here, is there any more questions? You're welcome to come up to the mic. Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you for your time this morning. I want to thank the audience members also for your contributions and attention. This will be posted on the city's website. As I said, that there's going to be an RFQ process that will, and that's going to work with a community benefits committee starting in November. So with hopefully that RFQ released in the beginning of 2026, and hopefully with 10 years from now, some of the visions that were articulated here today, and also in the community events that we've been having, as well as the former panels, will come to fruition. We thank you all for playing your part in it.
Can we talk, just since we're out here, the conversation that Bill and, was it Shannon?
Yes.
Had with regard to kind of the order of things, would it be more effective for the city to identify its, if not preferred, but its view on what areas would be, from an environmental standpoint, what areas would be best suited for what type of development, so that all of your developers were kind of, bidding on the same Or relatively same project?
It would be great to first of all, to understand where the hot spots are and the current limitations, right? Because they change with administration and as tools come in.
Every time the name of
It would be
agency
great too, if we start to talk about community benefits, if there's going to have to be takeaways within that to understand early, like here's some of the things as a community or city that we're going to expect to be delivered. And I think to answer the last question, yes, in a broader master plan, if you're seeking incentives that are things in there and you want to make sure that you're aligning your community master plan with all of those pieces. But two, if you're going to do this by right, at the end of the day, you have to understand, remember, because Dorsey was by right, we still had to go through PUD because we had to take building code in. If we're gonna, to me, it sounds like they want to do this very similar to a new traditional master plan, which would be within this own community and master planning, right? So you guys need to take into account if you're maximizing your zoning, that you have to look at your building code, or it won't be by right. So those are things I think that would make the development stronger in all of these pieces to come in. And that, if this isn't a broader community master plan, you need someone with the master planning expertise that's gonna phase this out accordingly. Two, the same thing, the strength of this. And I'm in my past, one of my developments was Mason Run. We did, and that was a cleanup of a paper mill. We buried all of that. That was a planning initiative for years with the city of Monroe, that we took all of that and we buried the majority of our contaminants from that under the roads and the lots strategically. Something like that is an overall effective environmental strategy. And just same things, know that if where you're looking at residential criteria, you will likely have to deed restrict that, or you're going to have to change your ordinance for wells.
Yeah, that one.
For wells, and even though you don't have septic, to meet Eagle. So some of that can be done early on from the city's perspective.
I think the if you don't do an ordinance, if you're going to do restrictions, even if it's just groundwater use, now's the time to do it when it's all under single ownership.
And what was it? There was just a couple of areas that didn't have those restrictions on groundwater use from the city perspective that we had to deed restrict. So if you guys are moving forward with Water Street, I would put those in the master plan now. And that's a question for Eagle, for maybe AQT and Eagle to talk about making sure that the updated requirements they need in ground use protection get updated in that master plan.
Yeah, we're in the process, the main focus was getting the PCB and hazardous material removed, right, with the funding source. So we've been hyper-focused on that. We're moving now to gathering more funds to do more evaluation on the site, because one of the challenges with the site is funds were extremely limited up until receiving an allocation for that. So there's only so much you can do, and quite honestly, a lot of the work was really focused on a trail that was installed there, which is a huge community asset. So we were more or less working with the city from the river backward toward Michigan Avenue based upon funding sources and what was happening there. So now that we have more access to funding sources, we are evaluating areas that haven't been evaluated for 20 plus years from a testing standpoint in preparation for the RFQ to provide as much background information on the site from an environmental perspective to developers as we can. But the other component of this is you may not necessarily have to deed restrict. It's currently one entire parcel.
Yeah.
Right, so we have to be cautious on what we're doing for one entire parcel when certain portions will be broken off. And the other challenge is the historicals are based on 40 different parcels, right? So it's a little challenging because, when you're talking about restrictions, they really are based more or less on the historical use of the property based upon the previous contaminants and all those things. So it's kind of, like I mentioned, you can't do it all up front, right? I mean, you kind of have to work in tandem with what is proposed, what this, like, is gonna be sliced up and look like. I mean, there was previous infrastructure plans, layout plans done before. So it's kind of, and I think the city's moving forward on doing as much as they can up front, but you also need that feedback from developers.
I think you just need to do the high level stuff, because to your point, you don't want to go too far in the weeds on the
Right.
parcel, because then we haven't looked at engineering, design,
Yes,
and other
correct.
things that could create challenges.
Exactly, 100%.
So there's a fine line between doing a little bit right now to help this move and doing too much. And I think it's just maybe the updates to the groundwater that we found from Dorsey.
Well,
And the two things that made us have to go back and do the restrictions, and some making sure that you're aligning the key components of what you want to deliver in the site, the high level, and your overall master plan, because that will enhance anyone that has to go to a grant, especially mischief related. They're going to want to make sure that you've got it in your master plan,
And that one was strange because
right?
our understanding was that the groundwater shouldn't be an issue with the ordinance because it said that it was all Mickey City water anyhow, but then they still made you guys add it to the deed.
But your point regarding the community side is also valid, that, during the community evaluation design, what we want out there are restrictions. So
For your request for qualifications, what's your timeline, and how are you going to be able to get the best developers coming in with so much uncertainty? Like, are you planning to do obviously you'll have questions that people can ask, but I think you want to build in time that you can, if a lot of uncertainty comes up, how many people are going to walk away? How are you going to ensure on your process to get the best qualifications? I think you want to bake in all that time to do your homework so they could be like, well, what's your art? If you were filling out, tell us as a city what you're going to do for us so we know.
Sure. Yeah, I think that there's definitely is space to be able to have those conversations with people as they're filling it, before they're filling it out, and during that process. It is going to be a longer process because the city's also going to be meeting with the citizen committee to talk about benefits during that time. So I think that bakes in a little bit of that time for us to have those conversations then too.
It would be great to understand some of those benefits in advance, and then allow some dialogue as, on the finished plan, but as they said,
And that is also,
maybe managed a little bit more.
yes, yep. And that's the plan, is to get some of that in community input to inform the RFQ so that RFQ has it so that developers know at the get-go kind of what the community's hoping for in terms of benefit.
AKT, are you planning to do more borings? I know
Yes.
they've done quite a few already.
Yeah, well, like I mentioned, we did quite a large evaluation along the river trail based upon, what was immediate and the need there. In terms of preparing for the remediation of these PCBs, these PCBs were regulated by the federal government EPA, so we had to do a very specific type of sampling in order to prepare for this remediation. So that was what we were focused on. The next round that we're preparing for here, like right now, hopefully getting out there in the next month or so, is the whole strip of Michigan Avenue, which hasn't seen, there's been various activities over 25 years out there. There's been cleanup activities out there. There's been testing, but a lot of the data along Michigan Avenue is fairly old. So we're the cleanup's is ongoing, on its way. We're trying to now move to the frontage of Michigan Avenue to prep for this RFQ, so anyone coming in could have current data associated with what challenges may exist there.
Problem is my recollection is that the southwest corner of this site is partially in the floodplain. Is that the case?
Well, yeah, I believe that's correct. And you also have some landfilling activities down in that area as well.
Now, have you bored in the land?
Yes.
To see is it supportable? Would you have to put pipelines
No,
down?
we have more remediation to occur back there.
You have to do more remediation on that?
Yeah, so, yes, we have staged remediation process, but the current remediation we're doing right now is not gonna remediate all the PCBs right there. So, we have secured additional funding and hope to do more remediation toward the back end of the site in 2026. But, I mean, conceivably, our activities there shouldn't impact anything along, you know, the frontage of Michigan Avenue. I mean, no developer's gonna come in and develop from the back forward. It's just, yeah.
And if you look at some of those plans, they have their LIHTC right in this region. So, and maybe there's just gotta be things we identify to know that's never gonna happen.
Yeah.
The two things the city needs to know here, you know, number one, when you're looking at residential, what are you able to achieve? And what, I mean, anything can be done with enough money, but likely we're gonna go into a period of limited resources, changing resources. NEPA's changing right now, and what's coming out of this act, but you're going to have insurance and regulatory challenges here being in the floodplain and environmental insurance that will be considerable. So things that you need to look at in design, and when you're looking at these pieces, what do you want to achieve here? What resources do you have? That's just insurance from an insurance standpoint. Both on when we're delivering residential, you've got to look at those pieces from the site design as well.
We have this room till 12:30, so we can continue to talk about, Mateo and I may be in the background taking some things down, but that doesn't mean that you should rush until it's 12:25.
I'm sorry, AKT, and I missed your name.
Jeremy.
Jeremy, do you have enough data, you know, when, you know, you can get a limited closure with a restriction that says, in this area, if you're gonna put buildings, you gotta investigate to see whether there's VOC, you know, indoor air issues. Do you know enough about the site to identify the areas where you might have vapor concerns?
Well, that's why, I mean, one of the previous vapor concerns area is along Michigan Avenue. That is why we need to go test up there.
VOC2?
And, yeah, that's an area that was remediated also.
Under old
Before.
standards?
No, well, but it was through an EPA sub-grant, a cleanup grant, many moons ago, I mean, early 2000s-ish, right? So, you know, the remediation was removing down to a certain depth. I don't know if they got it all or not. It doesn't really matter what they did. We still have to test, right? So that's the intent, right? Is to, we're in the process of right now doing a phase one of the entire site, which has never been done before, right? Because the entire site was all individual phase ones, right? And the city filed their baseline environmental assessments when they secured it, but it was all individual phase one. So now that it's combined, right, we want to do an entire phase one of the site to start and then direct our evaluation based upon that phase one on the frontage, but we already know based upon historical review where we can pinpoint some activity up there. But that's the intent, right, is to really kind of, whether or not we're limited on how much we can do with certain funding sources, we're trying to do as much as we can from a data evaluation standpoint before this RFP goes out.
I would watch from the city's perspective. There's the federal reauthorization of the brownfield bill right now, which several legislators in Michigan are pushing, which is going to be a big deal to bigger barriers on Michigan Avenue and to maybe getting access to revolving VRA funds. And then in the big beautiful bill package right now, there's a deregulation of NEPA. There's going to be critical pieces to this site.
But the key to all this, I think, right, is a phased approach. And as long as the community, the city, everyone's in that understanding, we don't have to do it all right now, right? The key really is trying to find the area which we believe is Michigan Avenue, where a development can occur and set the stage for what this looks like. with limited infrastructure improvements there.
Hey, what's your timeline on when you're going to get an RFQ out?
The goal has been by the end of the first quarter in 2026. Whether that adjusts to second quarter a little bit, we'll see. First or second quarter of 2026.
I'm glad it wasn't a month or two away.
Yeah, and hopefully the big remediation activity we're doing right now will be complete as well, so we can, have that as a part of the package.
Yeah, and that was absolutely the right thing to do, get rid of those PCBs.
Well, there has been levels, so it's very costly.
Yeah, because that's,
Expensive loads of dirt going off the site right now.
yeah, I mean, it's one thing, residential developers not gonna, industrial developers don't wanna deal with that.
Yeah, no,
They
yeah.
want liability. Can't avoid it.